When the police told me my sister was dead, I thought it was a tragedy. Then they said I killed her. When the police showed up at my door after my sister disappeared, I thought they were going to tell me she was dead. What they said was so much worse. I texted Meredith 3 times on Tuesday and she didn't respond. By Wednesday morning, I drove to her apartment. The landlord said she'd moved out, taken everything, left no forwarding address. I went home confused. We'd just made plans for Saturday. Brunch at the place we'd gone every weekend since we were teenagers. Thursday morning, 2 detectives stood on my porch. "We need to ask you some questions about a recent death." My heart stopped. I thought they'd found Meredith's body. Instead, one pulled out a photo of a man I'd never seen before. "Do you know this person?" I shook my head. They looked at each other with that cop look, the one that says they don't believe you. "Can we come inside?" We sat in my living room and the detective leaned forward. "This man was found deceased in his apartment 2 days ago. We found your fingerprints on a kitchen knife at the scene, your hair on his couch, your credit card receipt in his trash." "That's impossible. I've never seen him. I've never been there." They asked where I was Monday night. "Home alone watching TV. No alibi." They asked if anyone had access to my belongings. That's when I realized. My spare key. Missing from the drawer last month. I'd assumed I'd misplaced it. "My sister Meredith has been to my apartment," I said slowly, the pieces starting to connect. "She's been missing since Tuesday." The detectives wrote down her information and left. Told me not to leave town. I spent that night going through my apartment. More things missing. A coffee mug. A scarf. A hairbrush I hadn't used in months. All things covered with my DNA. The detectives came back the next morning with photos from the crime scene. My scarf draped over the dead man's couch. My coffee mug in his sink with my lipstick on it. A receipt with my forged signature. "Someone is setting me up," I said, voice shaking. "The phone number you gave us for your sister is disconnected. The address is an empty apartment. We ran Meredith Collins and found nothing. No driver's license, no social security number, no records at all. That's impossible. She's my sister. We grew up together." "Ma'am, according to your parents, you don't have a sister." The room tilted. I called my mother from the police station, hands trembling. "Mom, tell them about Meredith. Tell them she's real." Silence on the line. Then, "Honey, who's Meredith?" "My sister, your daughter." "Sweetheart, you're an only child. You've always been an only child." The detective was watching me. I could see what he was thinking. Unstable, delusional, dangerous. They held me for 48 hours while my lawyer scrambled. That's when the truth started emerging, piece by piece. My mother had given birth to twins. Identical. But she'd only wanted one child. Meredith was given up at birth to a private adoption agency, records sealed. My parents never told me. Never told anyone. They'd erased her completely. But Meredith found out. Somehow, somewhere, she'd gotten the records. She'd tracked me down 8 years ago, introduced herself at a coffee shop like it was coincidence, became my best friend before revealing she was my sister. I'd been so happy. A sister I never knew. A connection I'd always felt was missing. 8 years she'd played the role. 8 years of brunches and holidays and late-night phone calls. 8 years of collecting my hair, my fingerprints, my habits, my signature. The victim was her ex-boyfriend. Restraining order. History of stalking her. She'd planned his murder for years. They found her notebook in a storage unit registered under my social security number. Every page detailed how she'd frame me, how she'd disappear, how I'd take the fall for everything. The last entry was dated 1 week before the murder. She abandoned me at birth. She got the parents, the childhood, the life that should have been mine. Now she'll get what she deserves. She wasn't framing a stranger. She was punishing me for existing, for being the twin they kept. My lawyer got the charges reduced. Evidence pointed to Meredith, but she'd vanished completely. New identity, new country probably. She'd had 8 years to plan her escape. I'm out on bail now. The case is technically still open. They can't convict me with the notebook evidence, but they can't convict her either. She's a ghost. I sat at our brunch place last Sunday, force of habit, ordered 2 coffees before remembering. The chair across from me stayed empty. My sister spent 8 years becoming my best friend. 8 years pretending to love me. 8 years waiting for the perfect moment to destroy my life because our mother chose me instead of her. And somewhere out there, she's still watching. I check my locks 3 times before bed now. It's never enough. I sit in my apartment the morning after checking my locks for the 3rd time, staring at my phone and wondering if I should call my parents again, or if there's any point. My coffee sits cold on the table next to me. I haven't slept more than 3 hours. Every small noise makes me jump. My phone buzzes and I grab it too fast, nearly dropping it. Alexander Gates, my lawyer, is texting me. He wants me to come to his office because the forensic team found something else in the storage unit. My hands shake as I read the message twice. What else could there possibly be? I grab my keys and head out, checking behind me twice before getting in my car. The drive to his office takes 20 minutes but feels longer. I check my rearview mirror constantly, looking for cars that might be following me. Nobody is there. I know nobody is there, but I check anyway. At Alexander's office, his secretary waves me through immediately. He's waiting with a manila folder on his desk and his face looks tired. He shows me additional pages from Meredith's notebook that the forensic team found wedged behind a false panel in the storage unit. These pages are different from the ones about the murder plan. These pages detail how she studied my handwriting for 2 years before she felt confident forging my signature. There are practice sheets with my name written hundreds of times, each one getting closer to my actual signature. The progression is clear. Early attempts look clumsy and wrong. Later ones are almost perfect. By the final page, I can't tell which signature is mine and which is hers. The level of patience and planning makes my stomach turn because this wasn't impulse or anger. This was cold, calculated revenge spanning nearly a decade. Alexander points to dates written in tiny numbers at the bottom of each page. She started practicing my signature 6 years ago. 6 years of planning while we had brunch every Saturday. 6 years of perfecting my handwriting while I told her about my work problems and dating disasters. I feel sick. Alexander asks if I'm okay and I nod even though I'm not. He makes copies for me to take home and I don't know why I want them. But I do. Detective Swift calls later that day while I'm sitting in my car in Alexander's parking lot, still holding the copies. She tells me they've identified the adoption agency that handled Meredith's placement. It was called New Beginnings Family Services, and it operated out of Portland until it closed in 2003. The records are sealed by court order from 1995, which means my parents must have requested the seal. Swift is working on getting them unsealed, but it could take weeks or months depending on the judge. She sounds frustrated, and I can tell she wants to give me better news. I thank her and hang up, feeling frustrated that even now, my parents' decision to hide Meredith continues to block answers I desperately need. If they had just told me the truth from the beginning, would any of this have happened? Would Meredith have felt less abandoned if she'd known I didn't know about her either? I start the car and drive home on autopilot, barely remembering the route. I force myself to go grocery shopping because I've been living on delivery food for 2 weeks, and I need to reclaim some normalcy. The store is crowded with people doing their regular Wednesday shopping, and the fluorescent lights feel too bright. I grab a cart and head to the produce section, trying to remember what I usually buy. Apples. I need apples. I'm reaching for a bag when I see her. A woman with dark hair like Meredith's, standing by the tomatoes. My heart stops. She's wearing a blue jacket. Meredith had a blue jacket. The woman turns slightly and I see her profile. My hands start shaking. I abandon my cart right there in the middle of the aisle and walk quickly toward the exit. She turns around fully and I see her face. It's not Meredith. The woman is older with different features. Nothing like my sister except the hair color. I keep walking anyway. I can't stop. I get to my car and sit there for 10 minutes, my hands shaking too badly to put the key in the ignition. A security guard walks by and looks at me with concern, but I wave that I'm fine. I'm not fine. I drive home with no groceries and order Chinese food on my phone. That night, I finally read through all the police reports Alexander gave me about Caleb Sutherland, the man Meredith killed. The file is thick, maybe 50 pages. Caleb was 32 when he died. He worked as a sales manager for a tech company. He'd been arrested twice for violating the restraining order Meredith had against him. The first arrest was for showing up at her workplace. According to the report, he waited in the parking lot for 3 hours until she came out, then followed her to her car. She called the police and they arrested him right there. He spent 2 nights in jail and paid a $500 fine. The second arrest was 6 months later for following her home from a grocery store. He drove behind her for 12 miles and she called 911 while driving. The police met her at her apartment and arrested him in his car across the street. That time he spent a week in jail. The reports paint him as obsessive and threatening, someone who couldn't accept that their relationship was over. I realize Meredith chose a victim whose death might seem justified if she'd been caught. She could have claimed self-defense. She could have said he broke in and attacked her. The restraining order history would have supported her story. But she didn't plan to get caught. She planned for me to take the fall. I call my mother against my better judgment because I need to understand how she could give away a baby and then pretend that baby never existed. The phone rings 3 times and I almost hang up. She answers on the 4th ring, her voice careful and distant. I ask her directly why she chose to keep me instead of Meredith. The question hangs in the air between us. She's quiet for so long I think she's hung up. Then she says it was random. They just picked one. Her voice is flat, like she's talking about choosing between 2 identical apples at the store. I realize that's somehow worse than any reason she could have given. If she'd said I looked healthier or cried less or had a birthmark she loved, at least that would be something. But random? A coin flip that determined everything about both our lives? I ask her if she ever thought about the other baby, the one she gave away. She starts crying and says she tried not to. She says she had to believe she made the right choice or she couldn't have lived with herself. I tell her I have to go and hang up before she can respond. I sit on my couch and stare at the wall for an hour. My first therapy appointment with Fern Collier feels awkward and forced because I don't know how to explain that my best friend of 8 years was actually my twin sister plotting to destroy my life. Her office is small and painted a calming blue color. There are plants on the windowsill and tissues on the side table. She's maybe 50, with gray hair and kind eyes. She asks me to tell her what brought me in, and I start talking. The words come out jumbled and wrong. I keep backtracking to explain things out of order. She listens without judgment and asks me what I'm most afraid of right now. I tell her the truth. Meredith is still out there, still watching, and I have no way to protect myself from someone who knows everything about me. She knows my schedule, my habits, my favorite places. She knows which window in my bedroom doesn't lock properly. She knows I keep my spare car key in my desk drawer. She spent 8 years learning every detail of my life. Fern asks what I'm doing to feel safe, and I tell her about checking the locks 3 times every night. She doesn't tell me to stop. She says that's a normal response to trauma, and will work on managing the anxiety so it doesn't control my life. I cry for the last 10 minutes of the session, and she hands me tissues without making it weird. Alexander files a motion to have my bail conditions modified, so I can at least travel within the state. He argues that I'm clearly not a flight risk, given that I reported the framing myself, and have cooperated fully with the investigation. The prosecutor, Donovan Baird, doesn't oppose it, which Alexander says is a good sign that they're not seriously pursuing charges against me anymore. The hearing is scheduled for Friday morning. I wear a conservative dress and sit quietly while Alexander presents his argument to the judge. The judge is a woman in her 60s who looks stern but fair. She reviews the motion for what feels like forever but is probably 5 minutes. Then she approves it. Just like that, I can travel within state lines. I feel a tiny bit of freedom return, even though I have nowhere I want to go. Alexander shakes my hand outside the courtroom and tells me this is real progress. I thank him and drive home, feeling slightly less trapped than I did this morning. Detective Swift contacts me with news that they've found surveillance footage from a gas station near Caleb's apartment. The footage shows Meredith filling up a car 2 hours before his estimated time of death. Swift emails me a screenshot from the video. The image is grainy but clearly shows her face. She's wearing my jacket, the brown leather one that went missing from my closet 3 months ago. I'd looked everywhere for that jacket. I'd assumed I'd left it somewhere and forgotten. But no, Meredith took it. She wore it to pump gas before murdering Caleb, making sure the cameras caught her in my clothes. This evidence further proves the framing, but it also confirms Meredith was meticulous about every detail. She thought about security cameras. She planned what to wear. She probably drove past that gas station multiple times to confirm it had cameras pointed at the pumps. Swift tells me this footage will help my case significantly. I thank her and stare at the screenshot for a long time. My sister is looking slightly away from the camera, her expression calm and focused. She looks like me. We have the same face, the same hair, the same build. Anyone who saw this footage would think it was me. I drive past the coffee shop where Meredith and I used to have brunch, but I can't bring myself to go inside yet. Instead, I park across the street and watch through the window as other people sit at tables and have normal conversations. A couple in their 20s laughs about something. An older man reads a newspaper while drinking coffee. A woman types on her laptop, probably working remotely. None of them are wondering if the person across from them is secretly plotting their destruction. None of them are checking over their shoulders constantly. I sit there for 20 minutes just watching normal people do normal things. My hands grip the steering wheel tightly. I want to go inside. I want to reclaim that space and those Saturday mornings, but I can't make myself open the car door. Finally, I start the engine and drive away, feeling pathetic but unable to reclaim that space yet. Maybe next week, maybe never. The next morning, my neighbor knocked on my door around 8. I'd been up for hours already, checking the locks again and staring at my phone. She looked nervous, kept glancing down the hallway like she wasn't sure she should be here. She told me she saw someone who looked exactly like me leaving my apartment the day Caleb died. She'd thought it was me at first, but then she noticed the shoes. Black heels, the kind with the pointed toe. She said I always wore flats or sneakers, never heels like that. The detail seemed small, but it stuck with her. Made her feel weird about it. When she saw the police at my door days later, she started putting things together. I thanked her 3 times, my voice shaking, and asked if she'd give a statement to Detective Swift. She agreed right away, said she'd call the detective herself that afternoon. After she left, I stood in my doorway for a full minute, just breathing. Someone else saw Meredith. Someone else could prove I wasn't the one at that apartment. Alexander called me 2 hours later with more news from the forensic team. They'd found Meredith's fingerprints in my apartment, but not in normal places. Inside my medicine cabinet, way in the back where I kept old prescription bottles I never touched. Inside my dresser drawers, underneath the clothes. In the back of my closet, behind boxes of winter stuff I hadn't opened in months. She'd been going through everything, taking inventory of my entire life. The analyst told Alexander it looked like someone conducting a search, not just visiting casually. I felt sick hearing this. Meredith had touched my things, moved them around, studied what I owned. She'd been in my bathroom, my bedroom, my private spaces. The framing felt almost easier to process than this. She'd invaded every corner of my home while pretending to be my sister, my friend. Alexander asked if I was okay, and I lied and said yes. I wasn't okay. I wanted to throw away everything I owned and start over in a place she'd never been. 3 days later, I sat in Donovan Baird's office downtown. The building was all glass and steel, modern and cold. Alexander came with me, sat beside me in the chair across from the prosecutor's desk. Donovan looked tired, like he'd been working too many cases for too many years. He told me directly that his office wasn't going to prosecute me. They were preparing to dismiss all charges formally. The evidence pointed clearly to Meredith now, and they were shifting all their resources to finding her. He apologized for what I'd been through, said he understood this had been horrible for me. I should have felt relieved. Alexander squeezed my shoulder, smiled at me, but I just felt empty. Clearing my name didn't undo what Meredith did. It didn't explain why she hated me enough to plan this for 8 years. It didn't bring me any closer to understanding how someone could pretend to love me while plotting my destruction. I thanked Donovan and left his office feeling hollow instead of free. My second therapy session with Fern happened on a Thursday afternoon. Her office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs, the kind of place designed to make you feel safe enough to fall apart. We talked about my sleep, my anxiety, the constant checking of locks. Then she asked me what I missed most about Meredith. The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on the betrayal, on the anger and fear, that I hadn't let myself think about missing her. But sitting there in that quiet office, I admitted the truth. I missed having a sister. I missed the feeling of having someone who understood me completely, who knew my history and my quirks and loved me anyway. Then I started crying. Big, ugly sobs that I couldn't control, because that person never existed. Everything I thought we shared was just Meredith studying me like I was some kind of experiment. Every laugh, every secret, every moment I thought we were connecting was her taking notes for my destruction. Fern handed me tissues and let me cry until I couldn't anymore. She didn't try to fix it or make it better. She just sat with me in the grief of losing someone who was never really there. Detective Swift called me the following week with news about the adoption records. She'd gotten them unsealed through a court order. Meredith had been placed with a family in Oregon right after birth. They returned her to the agency after 6 months. The paperwork said she was difficult and hard to manage as an infant. She spent 2 years in foster care after that, moving between different homes. Then a couple in Washington adopted her when she was 3. They raised her until she turned 18, but the detective said there were notes about behavioral problems and running away. My parents' decision to give her up created this whole childhood of abandonment and moving around. I got to stay in one house, with parents who wanted me, going to the same school and having the same friends. Meredith got returned like a broken product, shuffled around, never settling anywhere. I understood her anger better after hearing this. I still couldn't forgive what she did, but I understood where it came from. One random choice at birth gave me everything and gave her nothing. I forced myself to go back to work on Monday. The marketing firm where I'd worked for 3 years felt different now. Everyone knew what happened because it had been in the news. My coworkers were awkwardly nice, giving me space but also checking on me constantly. Sarah from accounting brought me coffee without asking. Mike from creative told me to take my time on deadlines. My boss called me into her office and told me to take whatever time I needed, that my job was secure. I insisted on working because sitting at home thinking about Meredith all day was making me crazy. I needed tasks, deadlines, normal work problems to focus on. By Wednesday, I'd finished 2 projects and felt almost like myself again. Work gave me structure, gave me something to do besides obsess over where Meredith was hiding. Alexander met me for coffee that Friday to update me on the investigation. He told me Interpol had been notified about Meredith. Her photo was distributed to law enforcement in dozens of countries, but he was honest with me in a way I appreciated. People disappear successfully all the time, especially when they've been planning it for years like Meredith had. She probably had multiple fake identities set up, money hidden in offshore accounts, an exit plan as detailed as her framing plan. The chances of finding her were slim. Even if they did locate her, getting her back to the country could take years. Extradition was complicated and slow. I stirred my coffee and watched the foam swirl. Alexander looked at me with genuine sympathy. He said he was sorry, that he wished he had better news. I told him I appreciated his honesty. At least I knew what I was dealing with. Meredith was gone, probably forever, and I had to figure out how to live with that. The nightmares started that week. Every night I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, convinced Meredith was standing at the foot of my bed watching me. I'd turn on every light, check every window, test every lock. Then I'd lie awake until sunrise, too scared to close my eyes again. The bags under my eyes got darker each day. I looked exhausted all the time. Fern told me this was a normal response to trauma, that my brain was processing the violation of trust and safety. Knowing it was normal didn't make it less scary. I was tired constantly, could barely focus at work. I started drinking coffee all day just to stay awake. My hands shook from the caffeine and the lack of sleep. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. I looked older, worn down, like I'd aged 5 years in the past month. My father called me for the first time since everything came out. His voice sounded strained, like he'd been practicing what to say. He tried to explain their decision. They were young when we were born, only 23. They were scared and broke, and the doctors told them raising twins would be twice as hard. They thought they were making the practical choice, the responsible choice. I listened without saying much because nothing he said would make this okay. We both knew it. The silence on the phone stretched out between us. Finally, he asked if I'd come to dinner this weekend. I told him I needed more time. He said he understood, but I could hear the hurt in his voice. I felt guilty, but also angry. They created this situation. They gave away my sister and never told me. Their guilt didn't fix anything. The coffee shop owner reached out to Detective Swift a few days later. Alexander called to tell me what she'd said. She remembered Meredith asking detailed questions about me over the years. What time did I usually arrive for brunch? Did I always order the same thing? What did I talk about? At the time, she thought Meredith was just being a caring sister, paying attention to my habits. Looking back, she realized Meredith was gathering information, studying my patterns. The owner felt terrible about it, offered to testify if Meredith was ever caught. I told Alexander to let her know she had nothing to feel guilty about. How could she have known? How could any of us have known? Meredith was that good at pretending, that patient in her planning. She fooled everyone, including me, for 8 solid years. I started going through my apartment the next morning, room by room, pulling out anything Meredith had ever given me. The necklace she'd bought me for my birthday sat on my dresser, a simple silver chain with a small pendant. I picked it up and looked at it for a long moment before dropping it in the trash bag. A throw pillow she'd said would match my couch perfectly went in next. 3 books she'd recommended, each one with her handwriting on the inside cover saying she thought I'd love them. A framed photo of us at a concert. A coffee maker she'd replaced when mine broke. Each item felt contaminated now, like touching them might somehow connect me back to her plans. I worked through every drawer, every closet, every shelf. By the time I finished, the trash bag was full and my apartment looked bare. The empty spaces on my shelves and walls made the place feel hollow, but at least I could breathe without seeing reminders of her everywhere I looked. I tied up the bag and carried it down to the dumpster, feeling lighter with each step away from my building. Detective Swift called 3 days later while I was at work. She asked if I could come to the station after my shift ended. I agreed and spent the rest of the day distracted, wondering what new information they'd found. When I arrived that evening, Swift led me to the same interview room where this whole nightmare had started. She spread photos across the table, showing a rundown motel about 30 miles outside the city. The sign out front advertised weekly rates and cable TV. Swift explained that they'd traced Meredith's movements in the weeks before Caleb's murder. She hadn't been living at the apartment address she'd given me at all. She'd been staying at this motel, paying cash every week, using a fake name. The clerk barely remembered her, said she kept to herself and never caused any problems. Swift showed me more photos, surveillance footage from the motel parking lot showing Meredith coming and going at odd hours. She'd been creating the illusion of her normal life with me while actually preparing for everything. The murder, the framing, her disappearance, all of it planned from that cheap motel room while I thought she was living her regular life across town. I stared at the grainy images of my sister walking to and from a motel room I'd never known existed. Swift said they'd searched the room after Meredith left, but it had been cleaned completely. No evidence, no clues about where she'd gone next. My therapy session with Fern the following week felt different. I told her about finding the motel photos, about how Meredith had been living this secret life right under my nose. Fern listened carefully, then introduced me to a concept I'd never heard before. Ambiguous loss, she called it. Grief for someone who isn't dead but is permanently gone from your life. She explained that it's often harder than regular grief because there's no closure, no funeral, no clear moment where you can say it's over and start moving forward. The mourning process never really ends because part of you keeps waiting for resolution that might never come. I sat with that idea for a while, feeling it settle into place. That was exactly what I was experiencing with Meredith. She wasn't dead, but she was gone in every way that mattered. I couldn't grieve her like I would a death because she was still out there somewhere, still a threat, still unresolved. Fern said naming these feelings sometimes makes them easier to carry. I wasn't sure I believed her, but having words for what I was going through did make me feel slightly less alone in it. A letter arrived at Detective Swift's office 2 weeks later, forwarded to her from the Washington couple who had adopted Meredith when she was 3 years old. Swift called me to come pick it up. The envelope was thick, several pages of careful handwriting on nice stationery. I sat in my car in the police station parking lot and read it. The couple expressed deep regret for not being able to help Meredith work through her abandonment issues when she was growing up. They described her as a difficult child who became increasingly troubled as a teenager. She'd run away multiple times, refused therapy, pulled away from any attempt they made to connect with her. At 17, she'd disappeared for good, and when she turned 18, she'd sent them a single letter saying she didn't want any further contact. They'd respected her wishes, hoping she'd reach out when she was ready. They had no idea she'd found me or what she was planning. The letter ended with an apology, as if they somehow could have prevented all of this if they'd just tried harder or done something different. I folded the pages carefully and put them back in the envelope. These people had tried to give Meredith a home, a family, a chance. She'd rejected all of it because it wasn't the life she thought she deserved. The life I had instead of her. Alexander called me at work the next Monday. His voice sounded pleased when he said the prosecutor's office had officially dismissed all charges against me. The case was closed as far as I was concerned. I should have felt relieved, maybe even happy. Instead, I just felt numb. I thanked him for his work, told him I appreciated everything he'd done. He surprised me by saying he planned to continue helping me pro bono if Meredith was ever located. He wanted to pursue any civil remedies we could, make sure she faced consequences for the identity theft and fraud, even if the murder charges were complicated by her disappearance. I didn't know what to say. Most lawyers would have moved on to their next case, but Alexander seemed genuinely invested in seeing this through. I told him I was grateful, and I meant it. The charges being dismissed should have felt like a victory, but my life was still destroyed in every way that mattered. My reputation was damaged, my sense of safety was gone, and my sister was out there somewhere, free and unpunished. My coworkers invited me to happy hour that Friday, trying to include me in normal social activities again. I forced myself to go, determined to prove I could still do regular things like a regular person. The bar was loud and crowded, everyone laughing and complaining about work stuff that seemed so trivial compared to what I'd been through. I lasted about 30 minutes before the noise became overwhelming and I had to leave. Everyone else was having conversations about difficult bosses and annoying clients and bad dates. Their problems felt so normal, so manageable. I stood there with my drink, feeling like I was watching them through glass, unable to connect with a world where the worst betrayal was a cheating boyfriend or getting passed over for a promotion. I made an excuse about not feeling well and left early. In my car, I sat with my head against the steering wheel, frustrated by how damaged I felt. Meredith had taken away my ability to just exist normally with other people. My mother showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Saturday afternoon. I saw her through the peephole and almost didn't open the door. Curiosity won out over anger. She looked older than I remembered, more gray in her hair, deeper lines around her eyes. She was carrying a cardboard box, and when I let her in, she set it on my coffee table without saying anything at first. Inside were old photos from when I was a baby. She sat next to me on the couch, and we looked through them together. 2 identical infants in every picture. One in a pink onesie, one in yellow. One being held by my father, one by my mother. She pointed to a photo and admitted she didn't know which baby was which. They'd dressed us differently to tell us apart, but in these pictures, she couldn't remember which outfit belonged to which twin. We could be looking at photos of me or photos of Meredith, and there was no way to know. She said something that made my stomach turn. She sometimes wondered if they'd accidentally sent home the wrong twin from the hospital. If maybe I was actually Meredith and Meredith was actually me. I stared at her, not knowing how to respond to that. The idea that our entire lives might have been swapped by chance, that she might have kept the wrong daughter and given away the one she'd meant to keep. It shouldn't have mattered, but somehow it made everything feel even more random and cruel. Detective Swift called me again a few days later with more bad news. They'd found evidence that Meredith had been using my identity to open credit cards and bank accounts over the past year. The amounts were significant, nearly $50,000 that she'd never have to pay back because it was all in my name. Swift walked me through the accounts they'd found so far, but she warned there might be more they hadn't discovered yet. I felt sick listening to the list. Meredith had been building financial resources for her disappearance while destroying my credit and leaving me with debt I'd never agreed to. Alexander helped me file fraud reports with every bank and credit card company. We froze my credit, filed police reports, started the long process of proving I hadn't opened these accounts. He explained it could take months or even years to fully clear my name financially. The identity theft was just another layer of violation on top of everything else she'd done. Every time I thought I understood the full scope of her betrayal, something new emerged to show me it went even deeper than I'd imagined. Fern had recommended a support group for victims of stalking and identity theft. I'd been putting it off, not wanting to sit in a room full of strangers and share my story. But after learning about the financial fraud, I decided to give it a try. The group met in a church basement on Tuesday evenings. About 8 people sat in a circle of folding chairs. A woman around my age talked about how her ex-boyfriend had stolen her identity and destroyed her credit, opening accounts and taking out loans in her name before disappearing. The details were different from my situation, but the feeling she described was exactly the same. Having your life hijacked by someone you trusted. Feeling violated in a way that went beyond just the financial damage. When it was my turn to share, I gave a brief version of my story. I didn't go into all the details, just said my sister had framed me for murder and stolen my identity. People nodded with understanding that felt genuine. No one looked shocked or asked intrusive questions. They just listened and understood. For the first time since this started, I was in a room full of people who got it without me having to explain. The prosecutor's office held a press conference the following week, announcing that I'd been cleared, and they were actively searching for Meredith. My name was all over the news again. I had to take the day off work because reporters showed up at my office building trying to get a statement. They called my cell phone, sent emails, even knocked on my apartment door. Alexander handled all the media inquiries. He gave a brief statement saying I was relieved to be cleared and hoped law enforcement would locate my sister soon. I was grateful he dealt with it because I had nothing to say that wouldn't sound either pathetic or full of rage. The news coverage dredged everything back up. My coworkers, who had finally stopped walking on eggshells around me, went back to giving me sympathetic looks. Strangers recognized me at the grocery store. I stayed home for 3 days, ordering food delivery and ignoring my phone, waiting for the media attention to die down again. I took a week before I could make myself walk back to the coffee shop. The building looked exactly the same from the outside. Same brick walls and painted sign, but everything felt different now. I parked across the street and sat in my car for 10 minutes, watching people go in and out like it was any normal day. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I finally forced myself to get out and cross the street. The door chimed when I pushed it open. The owner looked up from behind the counter and her face changed immediately. She came around fast and pulled me into a hug before I could say anything. She smelled like coffee and vanilla. She pulled back and held my shoulders, looking at me with tears in her eyes. She said she was so sorry, that she never saw what was happening, that she'd answered questions from the police and felt sick about every conversation she'd ever had with Meredith. I told her it wasn't her fault. She insisted on making my usual coffee for free. I took it and looked at our table by the window, the one we'd sat at every Saturday for years. I couldn't sit there. I chose a different table near the back, facing the door so I could see everyone who came in. The coffee tasted the same, but drinking it alone felt wrong. I made myself finish the whole cup before leaving. When I told Fern about it at my next session, she said reclaiming spaces was an important part of healing. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I wasn't sure I believed her, but I'd done it anyway. Detective Swift called 2 days later and asked me to come to the station. She had something to show me. I drove there with my stomach in knots, not knowing what to expect. She led me to a small room with a computer screen and pulled up security footage. The timestamp showed dates from 3 years ago. The footage was grainy black and white from a storage facility. She explained this was the place where they'd found Meredith's notebook. I watched the screen. A woman walked into frame and I recognized her immediately even though her back was to the camera. She unlocked a unit, pulled up the metal door and disappeared inside. Swift fast-forwarded through hours of footage. Meredith stayed in that unit for 3 hours that first visit. The detective showed me more clips. Meredith came back every few weeks over 3 years. Same unit, same routine. She'd rented it under a fake name and paid cash for everything, but the cameras had caught her face clearly in several shots. I watched her walk in and out, carrying notebooks and boxes, completely calm. She looked normal. She looked like my sister. Swift said the footage proved Meredith had been planning this for years, visiting regularly to work on her revenge plans. Watching her unlock the unit and spend hours inside made my skin crawl. She'd been doing this the whole time we were having brunch together, the whole time she was pretending to be my friend. Fern suggested I take a self-defense class. She said it might help me feel less helpless. I wasn't sure it would make any real difference because if Meredith came back, I doubted I could actually fight her off. But I signed up anyway at a gym 3 blocks from my apartment. The instructor was a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and calm eyes. She was patient when I showed up, obviously anxious the first night. The class had about 12 people, mostly women, all different ages. Nobody knew my story, and I liked being anonymous. The instructor taught us basic strikes and how to get out of holds. The physical activity helped. I slept slightly better on class nights. My body was tired in a good way, instead of just exhausted from anxiety. The other students were friendly, but didn't ask personal questions. I could just be another person learning to protect herself. I went twice a week and started to feel a tiny bit less afraid walking to my car at night. My father called on a Thursday afternoon while I was at home. He asked if I was ready to talk to them both. I almost said no out of habit, but something made me say yes instead. I surprised myself. We agreed to meet at a restaurant downtown, neutral territory, not their house. I got there first and sat in a booth near the back. My parents arrived together 5 minutes later. They looked older than I remembered. My mother's face was puffy like she'd been crying. My father looked defeated, shoulders slumped. We ordered food none of us really wanted. The conversation was painful and awkward. My mother cried and apologized multiple times. My father kept saying they'd made a terrible mistake. They tried to explain their reasoning, but nothing they said made it okay. I realized sitting there that they were going to carry guilt about this for the rest of their lives. That didn't fix anything, but it was something. I told them I needed time before we could have any kind of normal relationship again. They both nodded and said they understood. They accepted it without arguing. We ate in mostly silence. When we left, my mother hugged me tight and whispered that she loved me. I didn't say it back, but I didn't pull away either. Alexander called me into his office the following week with new information. He'd been digging into Meredith's background. He'd discovered she'd filed a legal name change 2 years ago. This meant she'd been operating under at least 2 identities, the name she used with me and whatever name she'd changed to legally. He showed me the court documents. The new name was Sarah Mitchell. Completely different. He explained this made finding her much harder because she could have multiple passports and identities layered on top of each other. She might have other names we didn't know about. The FBI was now involved because the identity theft crossed state lines. Alexander had been in contact with an agent who was working the case. But even the FBI admitted the trail was cold. Meredith had been too careful, planned too well. She could be anywhere in the world using any name. The chances of finding her kept getting smaller. My friend Rachel set me up on a blind date with someone she knew from work. I agreed because I was desperate to prove to myself that I could still trust people and have normal relationships. His name was Tom, and he was perfectly nice. We met at an Italian restaurant on a Saturday night. I was on edge from the moment I sat down. I analyzed everything he said for hidden meanings and lies. When he asked about my family, I gave vague answers and changed the subject fast. When he talked about his job, I wondered if he was really telling the truth or making it all up. I couldn't relax. My shoulders stayed tense the whole meal. I kept checking the exits and watching other diners. Tom noticed I was uncomfortable. He asked if I was okay. I lied and said I was fine. We both knew there wouldn't be a second date. When we said goodbye in the parking lot, he was polite but distant. I got in my car and cried, frustrated by how much Meredith had taken from me. I couldn't even have a normal dinner with a nice person without falling apart. At my next therapy session, Fern and I worked on strategies for managing my paranoia and hypervigilance. She taught me grounding techniques for when I started spiraling into worst-case scenarios. She had me practice focusing on my 5 senses to stay in the present moment. She was honest that I might always have some level of anxiety about trust and safety, but she believed I could get to a place where it didn't control my entire life. I wanted to believe her. Right now, it felt impossible. Every time I started to relax, something would trigger me and I'd be right back to checking locks and watching strangers. Fern said healing wasn't linear. There would be good days and bad days. I just had to keep working at it. Detective Swift contacted me again a few days later. She said they'd identified 3 other people Meredith had contact with over the years, who might have information about her plans. They were interviewing each of them. One was a former co-worker who remembered Meredith talking about feeling abandoned by her birth family. Another was a therapist Meredith had seen briefly before stopping treatment. The third was a woman who'd lived in the same apartment building as Meredith years ago. Swift said none of them had seen this coming. They all described Meredith as quiet and private, but seemed normal enough. Nobody had suspected she was capable of murder and framing her own sister. The interviews weren't giving them useful leads on where she might have gone, but they were building a fuller picture of who Meredith really was. I got a notification on my phone that someone had tried to use one of my credit cards in Mexico. My heart started racing immediately. I thought it might be Meredith. I called the credit card company with shaking hands. They explained it was regular credit fraud, not connected to my case. Someone had stolen the card number and tried to buy electronics. The incident sent me into a panic attack anyway. I sat on my bathroom floor using all of Fern's grounding techniques to calm down. I focused on the cold tile under my hands. I counted my breaths. I named 5 things I could see. It took 20 minutes before my heart rate came back to normal. I was exhausted by how much energy it took just to function through a normal day. Every little thing felt like a crisis. My boss called me into her office on a Tuesday morning. She suggested I take a leave of absence because my work performance was suffering. Part of me wanted to argue and insist I was fine, but I knew she was right. I could barely focus on anything. I'd missed several deadlines. I'd shown up late multiple times. I agreed to take a month off. The relief of not having to pretend to be okay at work every day was immediate. I wouldn't have to force myself to act normal in meetings or make small talk in the break room. I could use the time to focus on therapy and trying to rebuild some sense of stability. I cleaned out my desk that afternoon and drove home feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I spent the whole weekend going through my phone. 8 years of text messages with Meredith sat in my archive, waiting to be read with new eyes. I started at the beginning, back when she first told me she was my sister. The messages were careful at first, testing boundaries, building trust. Then they got warmer, more personal. By year 2, we were texting every day. Good morning messages, random thoughts, photos of coffee cups and sunsets. I scrolled through thousands of messages, looking for the manipulation I'd missed. It was everywhere. She'd ask what time I left for work, what route I took, whether I locked my bedroom door at night. At the time, I thought she was being protective. A caring sister worried about my safety. Now I could see her building a map of my life. She asked about my morning routine, my evening habits, where I kept my spare key. She'd screenshot my calendar when I sent her my schedule. She collected details about my handwriting, asking me to send photos of grocery lists and birthday cards. Every conversation was intelligence gathering wrapped in sisterly concern. I found a message from 3 years ago where she asked what perfume I wore. I'd sent her the name and she said she wanted to try it. Now I knew she was probably buying it to smell like me, to be me. The messages where she said she loved me felt like weapons, each one designed to make me trust her more completely, to make me vulnerable. I read for hours until my eyes burned and my head ached. Detective Swift called me Tuesday morning. She said Meredith's therapist had reached out through proper legal channels. The therapist couldn't share much because of privacy laws, but she'd gotten clearance to provide information relevant to the investigation. Swift asked if I wanted to come to the station to hear what the therapist had to say. I drove there with my hands tight on the steering wheel. The therapist's name was Dr. Finley, and she'd seen Meredith for 4 months about 2 years ago. She sat across from Swift's desk looking uncomfortable, like she didn't want to be there. Dr. Finley explained that Meredith had come to therapy saying she felt disconnected from her family. She'd talked about being adopted, about feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. Then she'd started talking about me, about how I had everything she should have had. The parents, the stable childhood, the life that was supposed to be hers. Dr. Finley said Meredith expressed intense anger toward our parents for choosing me. She felt they'd stolen her future and given it to someone else. She fantasized about making me understand what abandonment felt like, about taking away my sense of safety the way hers had been taken. Dr. Finley had tried to help her process these feelings in healthy ways. She'd suggested confronting our parents, or at least talking to me honestly about her pain. But Meredith refused. She said talking wouldn't change anything. She stopped coming to therapy after the 4th month. Dr. Finley tried to follow up, but Meredith never responded. Looking back, Finley realized Meredith had probably been testing ideas in therapy, seeing what a professional would say about her revenge fantasies. When Dr. and Finley tried to redirect her toward healthy coping, Meredith just stopped coming. Swift thanked Dr. Finley for coming forward. After she left, Swift looked at me with sympathy. She said it was clear Meredith had been planning this for years, maybe since the moment she found me. I got in my car and just started driving. I didn't have a plan, but I ended up heading north toward Washington, toward the town where Meredith's adoptive parents had raised her. The drive took 3 hours. I didn't know what I was looking for. Answers that didn't exist, probably. Some way to understand how abandonment turned into murder and framing. The address was in a quiet suburb with tree-lined streets and normal houses. I parked across from the 2-story home with blue shutters and a neat front lawn. It looked completely ordinary. I sat there staring at the windows, trying to imagine Meredith as a child inside those walls, trying to picture what happened to turn her into someone capable of what she did to me. A woman came out of the house next door and walked toward my car. She looked concerned, probably wondering why someone was sitting in a parked car staring at houses. She knocked on my window and I rolled it down. She asked if I needed help or if I was lost. I said I was fine, just leaving. She watched me pull away with suspicious eyes. I drove back home feeling stupid. What did I think I'd find there? Some obvious sign of trauma? Some explanation written on the walls? The house was just a house. Whatever happened to Meredith happened inside her, in places I'd never be able to see or understand. The trip was pointless. Alexander called Wednesday asking me to come to his office. He said we should talk about filing a civil lawsuit against Meredith even though she'd disappeared. I met him Thursday afternoon. His office was downtown in a building with glass walls and expensive furniture. He explained that we could sue her for identity theft, fraud, emotional distress, and a bunch of other things. The lawsuit probably wouldn't result in collecting any money since we had no idea where she was or what assets she had. But it would create a legal record of the damage she caused. It would establish officially that she'd harmed me in ways that deserved compensation. Alexander said it gave me some control over the narrative. Instead of just being a victim, I could take legal action. I could fight back even if she wasn't there to face consequences. We spent 2 hours going through everything she'd done, every credit card she opened in my name, every piece of my property she stole, every way she'd violated my privacy and safety. Writing it all down in legal language made it feel more real somehow, more concrete. The harm wasn't just in my head. It was documented, measured, recorded. Alexander said he'd file the paperwork next week. He wasn't charging me because he said my case bothered him more than most. He wanted to help. I thanked him and left feeling slightly more in control. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Fern suggested I start journaling. She said writing letters to Meredith that I'd never send might help me process everything. I bought a notebook that night and sat at my kitchen table staring at the blank page. I started writing, "Dear Meredith." Then I crossed it out. She wasn't dear. She was a stranger who'd pretended to be my sister. I started over. The words poured out fast and angry. I asked why she didn't just confront me when she found out about the adoption. Why she spent 8 years building a relationship just to destroy it. I wrote about the brunches and the late-night phone calls and the birthday presents. About how real it all felt. How much I'd loved having a sister. I wrote about the rage I felt knowing every moment was a lie. Every hug was manipulation. Every time she said she loved me was just her getting closer to her goal. I asked questions I knew she'd never answer. Did she ever actually like me? Was any part of our relationship real? Did she feel anything when she framed me for murder? I wrote about the grief. About mourning a sister who never existed. About losing 8 years of my life to someone's revenge plot. The words filled page after page. My hand cramped, but I kept writing. When I finally stopped, I'd filled 20 pages. I felt exhausted, but lighter somehow. Like I'd transferred some of the weight from my chest onto the paper. Fern was right. It helped. Detective Swift called Friday afternoon. She said Interpol had spotted someone matching Meredith's description in Barcelona. A woman with her face had been caught on security camera at a hotel. By the time local police responded to check it out, the woman was gone. The hotel clerk said she'd paid cash and checked out that morning. They weren't even certain it was really Meredith. The image was grainy and the woman wore sunglasses. But the facial recognition software said it was a possible match. Swift said they were following up, but not to get my hopes up. Even if it was her, she was probably long gone by now. I hung up feeling weird. Part of me hoped they'd find her. Hoped she'd face consequences for what she did. But another part of me was scared. If she was still out there, still free, did that mean she could come back? Could she hurt me again? I spent the weekend jumping at shadows. Every stranger on the street could be her. Every car that drove past my apartment could be her watching. The fear sat in my chest like a stone. I checked my locks 5 times before bed. It still didn't feel like enough. My mother's email came Sunday morning. The subject line just said, "I'm sorry." I almost deleted it without reading, but I opened it. She wrote 3 pages explaining everything. She said after we were born, she had severe postpartum depression. She couldn't eat or sleep. She cried constantly. The idea of taking care of 2 babies felt impossible. She was drowning. The doctors suggested giving one up for adoption. Just temporarily, they said, until she felt better. But once Meredith was gone, my mother couldn't face bringing her back. She'd convinced herself that Meredith was better off, that the adoptive family could give her more than my mother could. She buried the guilt so deep she almost forgot. She built a life around the lie that I was an only child. She said she'd regretted it every single day but couldn't figure out how to undo it. By the time she could have tried to find Meredith, too many years had passed. She was too ashamed. She wrote that she understood if I never forgave her, that she'd destroyed 2 lives with one decision made in a moment of weakness and fear. I read the email 3 times. I felt sympathy for her struggle. Postpartum depression was real and serious. But I also felt angry. Her mental health crisis had created Meredith's lifetime of trauma. Her choice had set everything in motion. I didn't respond to the email. I didn't know what to say. I went back to work Monday. My coworkers had mostly moved on to other drama. Someone was having an affair. Someone else was leaving for a new job. My situation was old news. It was a relief to not be the center of attention anymore. My boss called me into her office first thing. She asked how I was doing and said to let her know if I needed anything. Then she gave me a stack of projects that needed attention. Normal work stuff. I threw myself into it. Spreadsheets and presentations and client emails. Tasks that required focus but not emotional energy. It felt good to use my brain for something other than obsessing over Meredith. My coworkers were nice but not overly sympathetic. They treated me normally, which was exactly what I needed. By the end of the week, I felt almost competent again. Like I was a professional with skills and value, not just a victim with a tragic story. My boss checked in regularly but didn't hover. She gave me space to rebuild my confidence. Slowly, I started feeling like myself again. Fern and I had been meeting twice a week for over a month. Our sessions were shifting. We talked less about the immediate crisis and more about long-term healing. She asked how I was doing with trust. I admitted I was struggling. Every time someone was nice to me, I wondered what they wanted. Every time someone asked personal questions, I wondered if they were gathering information. Fern said that was normal after what I'd been through. But she also said Meredith's betrayal didn't mean everyone would betray me. She helped me see patterns. Meredith had love-bombed me from the start. She'd pushed for closeness too fast. She'd been too interested in details that didn't matter. Normal people don't interrogate you about your daily schedule. Normal people don't ask where you keep your spare key. Fern taught me to watch for red flags while also staying open to genuine connection. She said I could learn to trust again without being naive. It would take time and practice. Some days I believed her. Other days I felt like I'd never trust anyone completely again. But I was having moments where I didn't think about Meredith for hours at a time, where I could focus on work or a conversation without fear creeping in. It was progress. Slow, but real. The FBI agent called Tuesday. His name was Lancaster. He said they'd traced some of Meredith's financial activity to accounts in the Cayman Islands. She'd been moving money offshore for at least 3 years. Small amounts at first, then larger transfers. By the time she disappeared, she'd moved over $200,000. The sophistication of her planning was staggering. She'd set up shell companies, used multiple fake identities, created layers of financial protection. Lancaster said people who plan this carefully are almost never caught unless they make a mistake. They get comfortable and slip up. But Meredith had been careful for 8 years. She probably wouldn't get sloppy now. He promised they'd keep looking, that the case would stay active. But I could hear in his voice that he didn't expect to find her. I thanked him and hung up. I sat on my couch staring at nothing. Meredith had won. She'd destroyed my life and disappeared into her new one. She was probably on a beach somewhere drinking expensive wine with money she'd stolen from me. And I was here, picking up pieces, trying to rebuild. It wasn't fair, but fairness didn't matter. This was reality. I had to figure out how to live with it. I booked the conference 2 weeks in advance, my first trip since everything happened. My boss asked if I was ready for it, and I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. The hotel was 3 hours away in Portland, and I drove myself instead of flying because airports felt too exposed. I checked into my room and immediately tested the locks on the door and windows. The deadbolt worked. The chain lock worked. The sliding glass door to the balcony locked from the inside. I checked them all twice, then felt stupid for checking them twice, then checked them a third time anyway. The conference started the next morning. I sat through presentations on digital marketing strategies and social media trends, and for long stretches, I actually focused on the content instead of scanning the room for threats. I had good conversations with colleagues from other companies. We talked about algorithm changes and engagement metrics and budget allocation. Normal work stuff, professional stuff. One woman asked if I wanted to grab dinner with a group, and I said yes, even though my instinct was to hide in my hotel room. We went to a restaurant downtown, and I ordered pasta and listened to people complain about their bosses and their workloads. I contributed to the conversation. I laughed at jokes. For 2 hours, I felt almost normal. Back in my room that night, I checked the locks again before bed. But I also felt proud of myself for getting through the day without falling apart. The second day went even better. I asked questions during a panel discussion. I exchanged business cards with 3 people. I stayed for the evening networking event instead of leaving early. My hands shook when someone approached me from behind without warning, but I recovered quickly and had a normal conversation. The third day, I actually enjoyed parts of the conference. I took notes during sessions. I made plans to follow up with contacts when I got back. On the drive home, I realized I'd gone 3 full days without a major panic attack. The fear was still there, humming under everything, but I'd functioned anyway. Progress. My mother called the week before Thanksgiving and asked if I'd come to dinner. I told her I needed to think about it. I brought it up with Fern at our next session, and she asked what I was afraid would happen if I went. I said I was afraid of sitting at a table with them and feeling nothing but anger. Or worse, feeling the old automatic love and forgiveness before I was ready to give it. Fern said both reactions would be normal, and going didn't mean I had to resolve anything. It could just be a meal. Just showing up. I called my mother back and said I'd come. Thanksgiving Day, I drove to their house with my stomach in knots. My father answered the door and hugged me carefully, like I might break. The house smelled like turkey and stuffing, the same smells from every Thanksgiving I could remember. We sat down at the dining room table, the 3 of us, and there was an empty space where a 4th person should have been. Nobody mentioned it directly. We talked about my job and the conference I'd attended. We talked about the weather turning cold. We talked about their neighbor who was selling his house. My mother passed me the mashed potatoes and asked if I wanted more cranberry sauce. Normal conversation. Surface conversation. My father told a story about something funny that happened at the hardware store where he worked. I laughed at the right moment. My mother looked at me with such desperate hope that I had to look away. She wanted me to say I forgave them. She wanted everything to go back to normal. I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I'd never be ready for that. But I could sit at this table and eat turkey and make small talk. That was something. After dinner, my mother tried to hug me and I let her, but my body stayed stiff. I drove home feeling exhausted and sad and also slightly relieved. I'd survived it. That was enough for now. Detective Swift called the following week. Her voice had that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news. She said the case was moved to inactive status. They'd followed every lead they had. The Interpol sighting in Barcelona turned out to be someone else. The financial trail in the Cayman Islands went cold. Meredith had planned too well. She told me the case would stay open and they'd follow up on any new information, but I could hear what she wasn't saying. She didn't expect to find Meredith. Nobody did. I thanked her for everything she'd done. She'd been kind to me when she didn't have to be. She'd believed me when the evidence looked bad. She said she was sorry Meredith was getting away with this, and I said I was sorry too. We both sat with that unfairness for a moment before hanging up. I sat on my couch staring at my phone. Meredith had won. She'd destroyed my life and disappeared into her new one with money and freedom and probably a beach somewhere. And I was here trying to rebuild from rubble. It wasn't fair, but fairness didn't matter anymore. This was just reality now. The guy from my self-defense class asked me out the next week. His name was Joseph, and he had kind eyes and a quiet way of talking. I said yes before I could overthink it. We met for coffee on a Saturday afternoon, neutral territory where I could leave easily if I needed to. He asked about my job, and I told him about the marketing firm. He told me he worked in IT for a hospital. We talked about movies we'd seen recently and restaurants we liked. Normal first date stuff. Then he asked about my family, and my chest got tight. I gave him the simplified version. I said I had complicated family stuff and left out the details about murder and framing and identical twin sisters who spent 8 years plotting revenge. He nodded like he understood complicated family stuff. He didn't push for more information. We talked for over an hour, and I was present for most of it. My mind only wandered to worst-case scenarios a few times. When we left, he asked if I wanted to do it again sometime, and I said yes. Walking to my car, I felt terrified and also proud of myself. I was reclaiming this part of my life. Dating, connection, the possibility of trust. It was scary, but it also felt important. I spent a Saturday afternoon going through my apartment and gathering every photo of Meredith and me. There were dozens of them. Us at brunch, us at the beach, us at Christmas. 8 years of fake sisterhood documented in frames on my walls and shelves. I took them all down and put them in a cardboard box. I didn't throw them away. Fern said that was healthy. Not erasing the past, but giving myself permission to not dwell on it constantly. The box went in the back of my closet where I wouldn't see it every day. My apartment looked bare afterward. There were empty spaces on the walls and gaps on the shelves. But it also felt lighter. Her face wasn't staring at me from every surface anymore. I could walk through my living room without being ambushed by memories of someone who never really existed. That night, I sat on my couch and looked around at the empty spaces. They'd fill eventually. New photos, new memories, a life that was actually mine. Alexander called and asked me to come to his office for a final meeting. He had the official paperwork showing all charges were dismissed. The case was closed from a legal standpoint. He told me I was one of the strongest people he'd ever represented. I didn't feel strong. I felt tired and scarred and wary of everyone, but I thanked him for saying it. He'd fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. He'd believed in my innocence and worked to prove it. Before I left, he wrote his personal cell number on the back of his business card and told me to call if I ever needed anything. Not just legal stuff. Anything. I was touched by his genuine care. He didn't have to do that. His job was over. But he wanted me to know I had someone I could reach out to. I put the card in my wallet and felt grateful for people like him. 6 months after Meredith disappeared, I was in a surprisingly good place. I still saw Fern every other week. I still checked my locks at night. I still had nightmares sometimes where Meredith stood at the foot of my bed watching me. But I was also working successfully. My projects at the firm were going well. I'd gotten positive feedback from my boss. I was dating Joseph, and it was going slowly but nicely. We'd been on 6 dates, and he still didn't know the full story. But he knew enough. He was patient with my anxiety. He didn't push for more than I could give. I was rebuilding my relationship with my parents slowly. We had dinner together once a month. The conversations were still careful and surface level, but we were trying. The fear that Meredith might return hadn't gone away, but it had become background noise instead of a constant scream. I could function despite it. I could have good days. I could laugh and work and connect with people. She hadn't destroyed me completely. My boss called me into her office on a Tuesday morning and I felt my stomach drop, expecting bad news. Instead, she told me she was promoting me to senior marketing manager. She said she was impressed by my work and my professionalism through an impossible situation. The promotion came with a raise and more responsibility and my own small team. I thanked her and tried not to cry in her office. After I left, I sat at my desk staring at my computer screen. I'd gotten promoted. Despite everything Meredith had done, I was still building a career. I was still moving forward. That night, Joseph took me out to celebrate. We went to a nice restaurant and ordered expensive wine. I told him about the promotion, and he was genuinely happy for me. A few of my coworkers joined us for drinks afterward. We laughed and toasted, and I felt genuinely happy for the first time in months. Meredith had tried to destroy my life, but I was still here, still working, still succeeding. That felt like winning. My mother asked if I wanted to get coffee, just the two of us. I hesitated but said yes. We met at a cafe downtown on a Sunday morning. She ordered a latte and I got black coffee. We sat by the window and for a few minutes neither of us said anything. Then she started talking. She told me about being 23 and pregnant with twins. She told me about the fear and the postpartum depression and the feeling that she couldn't handle 2 babies. She didn't make excuses. She said it was the worst decision she'd ever made, and she'd carried the guilt every day since. She said she'd tried to bury it so deep she almost convinced herself it never happened. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her I understood she'd been struggling, but her choice had created Meredith's entire life of abandonment and pain. I said I wasn't ready to forgive her yet. Maybe I never would be, but I could try to understand. She nodded and wiped her eyes. We sat there drinking our coffee and watching people walk by outside. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't resolution. But it was real and honest, and that felt like something. I started volunteering at an organization called Family Bridges that helped adopted children maintain connections with their birth families. I went through their training program and started working with families once a month. The work was hard but meaningful. I helped facilitate meetings between kids and their biological parents. I helped navigate complicated emotions and difficult conversations. I wanted something positive to come from what happened with Meredith. I wanted to help prevent other children from growing up feeling abandoned and erased. The coordinator told me my perspective was valuable. She said having someone who understood the complexity of adoption and family trauma made a difference. I drove home after my first volunteer session feeling purposeful in a way I hadn't in months. This couldn't undo what Meredith did, but it could maybe help other families avoid creating that kind of pain. 3 months later, Detective Swift's name appeared on my phone screen while I was making dinner. My hands froze on the cutting board. She hadn't called in weeks. I answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful and measured. She told me they'd found a body in rural Argentina. A car accident on a mountain road. The vehicle had gone over a cliff and burned. Dental records confirmed the identity. Meredith had been dead for 3 months. She'd been living under the name Maria Castellanos, working at a hotel in a small town near the Andes. The local police said she'd lost control on a sharp turn during a rainstorm. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, watching steam rise from the pot on the stove. Relief hit me first, sharp and immediate. She couldn't hurt me anymore. She couldn't come back. Then grief crashed in behind it, surprising and overwhelming. I'd lost my sister. Not the person who framed me, but the woman I'd believed was my best friend for 8 years. The brunches and late-night phone calls and birthday celebrations, all of it had been real to me, even if it was performance to her. And guilt followed, bitter and uncomfortable, because part of me was glad she was dead. I thanked Detective Swift and hung up. The pasta boiled over and I didn't move to turn it off. I called Fern that night and went to see her the next morning. She asked how I was feeling and I told her I didn't know. I'd cried for an hour after hanging up with Detective Swift, then felt nothing at all. Fern said grief was complicated when the person who hurt you dies. I was mourning multiple losses at once. The sister I thought I had, the relationship I believed we shared, the possibility of ever understanding why she did it, and also mourning Meredith herself, the damaged person whose life had been consumed by revenge and abandonment. Over the next week, I cried more than I had in all the months since she disappeared. I cried at work, in my car, in the grocery store produce section. My boyfriend held me while I sobbed and didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. Fern helped me understand that grief doesn't follow logic. I could hate what Meredith did and still mourn losing her. Both things could be true at the same time. My mother called 2 weeks after I learned about Meredith's death. She asked if I wanted to plan a memorial service. Something small, just the three of us. I thought about it for 2 days before saying yes. We met at a funeral home and picked out a simple urn for Meredith's ashes, which were being shipped from Argentina. My father looked older than I'd ever seen him. My mother kept touching the urn samples like she was trying to connect with something she'd lost decades ago. We held the service on a gray Saturday morning at a cemetery outside town. Just me, my parents, and a priest who didn't know any of us. My mother brought white roses and placed them on the ground where we'd scatter the ashes later. She cried quietly, her shoulders shaking. My father read a poem about forgiveness and second chances that made my throat tight. When it was my turn to speak, I talked about letting go. About how Meredith had been a victim of circumstances she didn't choose, even though she made terrible choices herself. About how holding on to anger would only hurt me, not her. My voice cracked on the last sentence, but I finished. It was sad and strange and necessary. We scattered the ashes together, each of us taking a handful. My mother whispered something I couldn't hear. My father squeezed my shoulder. We stood there for a few minutes in silence, then walked back to our cars. A month after the memorial, I went back to the coffee shop. I'd avoided it since learning Meredith was dead, but I needed to reclaim that space. I walked in during the morning rush and sat at our old table deliberately. The owner saw me and brought over a coffee without asking what I wanted. She sat down across from me, in the chair Meredith used to occupy. She asked how I was doing, and I told her the truth. Some days were okay, some days weren't. She said she'd thought about Meredith a lot since everything happened. How she'd seemed lonely sometimes, despite always smiling. How she'd asked detailed questions about my life that had seemed caring at the time, but felt calculating in retrospect. We talked about Meredith as a real person, not just the villain of my story. Someone who'd been abandoned as a baby and spent her whole life trying to make sense of that rejection. Someone who'd chosen revenge instead of healing. The owner said she understood why I'd grieve for her despite everything. I realized sitting there that I could hold both truths. Meredith had hurt me terribly and tried to destroy my life. And she'd also been a victim of my parents' choice, damaged in ways she couldn't overcome. Both things were real. My relationship with my boyfriend shifted after Meredith's death. The constant fear that had been between us, the hypervigilance and trust issues, started to ease. I could be more present with him, more vulnerable. We were having dinner at his apartment when he told me he was proud of how I'd handled everything. I'd been through something that would have broken most people, and I was still standing, still building a life. We talked about the future carefully, what we wanted, where we saw things going. I admitted I was still cautious about trust, still learning that not everyone would betray me. He said he understood and wasn't going anywhere. 2 months later, he met my parents for dinner at their house. I'd been nervous about it, but the evening was actually pleasant. My mother made pot roast and asked him about his work. My father told embarrassing stories about my childhood. We all laughed at something genuinely funny, and it felt normal, like we were moving forward together instead of being stuck in the past. At work, I threw myself into a major marketing campaign for a new product line. I spent 3 months developing the strategy, managing my team, and presenting to executives. When the campaign launched, it exceeded every performance metric we'd set. My boss called me into her office and told me the executive team was impressed. She said I'd shown exceptional leadership and creativity. The campaign was used as a model for future projects. My coworkers congratulated me, and I could see they viewed me differently now. Not as the woman whose sister tried to frame her for murder, but as someone competent and capable. Someone building a reputation based on her own merit. I was reclaiming my professional identity from Meredith's shadow, proving to myself and everyone else that I was more than what she'd tried to make me. Fern and I had our final regular therapy session on a Tuesday afternoon. She told me we were transitioning to occasional check-ins as needed, rather than weekly appointments. She said I'd done remarkable work processing trauma that would have broken many people. I'd learned to function despite ongoing fear. I'd rebuilt relationships with my parents despite their role in creating Meredith's pain. I'd started trusting again, carefully, but genuinely. I thanked her for helping me survive and then learn to actually live again. For teaching me that I could hold complicated feelings about Meredith without letting them consume me. For showing me that healing doesn't mean forgetting or forgiving everything, just learning to carry the weight differently. I left her office feeling grateful for the support system that had helped me through the darkest period of my life. My boyfriend, my parents despite everything, my coworkers, and Fern herself. I hadn't done this alone. A year after the police first showed up at my door, I stood in my apartment getting ready for a dinner party. I'd invited 6 friends and my boyfriend. I was making lasagna and garlic bread, setting the table with actual cloth napkins. I realized halfway through chopping vegetables that I'd gone the entire day without thinking about Meredith or checking my locks obsessively. The scars from her betrayal would always be part of me. I'd probably always be more cautious about trust than other people. I'd probably always have moments of paranoia when someone asked too many questions or seemed too interested in my life. But those scars didn't define me anymore. I'd built a life that was genuinely mine. Relationships based on real trust. Work I was proud of. A future I was excited about instead of afraid of. Meredith had wanted to destroy me. She'd wanted me to experience the abandonment and pain she'd felt her whole life. She'd spent 8 years planning my downfall. But I survived. I healed. I found a version of myself that was stronger and more authentic than before. The doorbell rang. I heard my friends laughing in the hallway. I walked to the door with a genuine smile and opened it wide, ready to enjoy an evening of connection and joy that no one could take away from me. All right, that's it for today. Honestly, I just love that you're here listening to these with me. It never gets old. Hope this one left you smiling a bit.